We can pay her half your salary, Brian laughed, leaning back in his chair. It's just business, Aurora. Nothing personal. I stared at him across his desk, the birthday card my colleagues had signed for me just hours earlier still tucked in my purse. The shock must have been evident on my face because he quickly continued. Look, Heather's been here 6 months now. You've trained her well. The pharmaceutical database system is running smoothly, and frankly, we don't need 2 people doing one job. Heather knows the basics, I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. But she doesn't understand the integration points, the system architecture, double quotes. Brian waved his hand dismissively. All documented in your process manuals, right? That's what I pay you for. Besides, young talent brings fresh perspectives. The industry's evolving. My name is Aurora Chen, 41 years old, and until 5 minutes ago, I was the Senior Database Integration Specialist at Medisync Pharmaceutical Services. For 3 years, I'd designed and maintained the complex system that tracked drug trials across multiple platforms, connecting research data with regulatory submission requirements for pharmaceutical companies across the country. When Brian hired Heather 6 months ago, I'd welcomed the help. The system had grown increasingly complex, and having someone manage the day-to-day operations would free me up to implement improvements I'd been planning for months. I'd spent countless hours training her, carefully walking her through the standard procedures, though there hadn't been time to cover the underlying architecture, the invisible connective tissue that made everything work seamlessly. I need your keycard and passwords before you leave today, Brian continued, sliding a severance agreement across the desk. 2 weeks' pay, standard confidentiality clauses. I scanned the document, the words blurring slightly. Today is my birthday, I said, the statement sounding hollow even to me. Brian had the decency to look uncomfortable for a moment. Sorry about the timing. HR picked the date. I signed the agreement mechanically, then stood up. Heather will need the emergency protocols for when systems don't synchronize properly. They're not in the documentation. I'm sure she'll figure it out, Brian replied, already checking his phone. She's quite resourceful. As I packed my desk, Heather approached, her expression a mixture of sympathy and awkwardness. I'm really sorry, she whispered. I had no idea this was happening. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I handed her my system notebook, a notification popped up on my computer screen. Database sync error on client trial DRX 1429, manual resolution required. I started to explain the error, but Brian appeared, ushering me toward the exit. Heather's got this, he said firmly. It's time for you to go. I smiled tightly. Good luck, I said, meaning it more sincerely than either of them could possibly understand. My path to Medisync began after 15 years in database architecture. I'd built systems for insurance companies, retail chains, and finally, the pharmaceutical industry, where data integrity could literally be a matter of life and death. Clinical trial information had to be seamlessly integrated across research platforms, regulatory submission systems, and client dashboards, with zero margin for error. When Medisync recruited me, they were struggling with an outdated system that frequently crashed. Within 6 months, I'd redesigned their entire architecture, creating a robust integration framework that accommodated their complex needs while maintaining regulatory compliance. Client satisfaction scores rose dramatically, and the company landed 3 major pharmaceutical contracts based largely on the strength of their innovative data management solutions I had built from the ground up. Brian Morgan became my manager a year ago when the previous director retired. He had a background in sales rather than technology, which initially concerned me, but I tried to be open-minded. He spoke constantly about optimization and streamlining operations, often questioning why processes couldn't be simplified. These verification steps seem excessive, he'd comment during review meetings. Couldn't we eliminate some of these redundancies? I'd patiently explain that what looked like redundancy was actually essential error-catching architecture. The system's strength lay in its multiple verification points that prevented data corruption from cascading through interconnected databases. Brian would nod, but I could tell he wasn't fully grasping the technical nuances. Still, I believed his business perspective complemented my technical expertise, and we maintained a cordial professional relationship. When he hired Heather, fresh out of college with a computer science degree but no real-world experience, I didn't object. Training a junior colleague seemed reasonable, and I enjoyed sharing my knowledge. Heather was eager and quick to learn the operational procedures, though she sometimes grew impatient with details. "Do we really need to run all these verification queries?" she'd ask. "It adds an hour to the process." "That hour prevents weeks of potential disaster recovery," I'd explain. "The system is more fragile than it appears." In recent weeks, I'd noticed Brian and Heather in frequent private meetings. I assumed they were discussing her professional development, perhaps planning to expand her responsibilities. I even prepared additional training materials, anticipating that she might take over some of my routine tasks. What I didn't anticipate was becoming completely expendable. In retrospect, the signs were there. Brian's increasing questions about whether my processes could be streamlined, his interest in detailed documentation, the gradual exclusion from strategic meetings. But I'd been too focused on improving the system and training my replacement to see what was happening. The morning after my unceremonious termination, I woke to a string of LinkedIn notifications. News of my departure had apparently spread quickly through professional circles. 3 former colleagues had sent messages expressing shock and asking if I was looking for new opportunities. I spent the day updating my resume and researching positions, trying to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the humiliation of being escorted from the building on my birthday. By evening, I'd lined up 2 promising interviews for later in the week. The pharmaceutical data integration field was specialized enough that experienced architects were always in demand. My phone rang just after dinner. It was Jacob, a developer from my former team at MediSync. "Aurora, I know you probably don't want to talk about work, but I'm stuck on something," he said, his voice tight with stress. "The DRX 1429 trial database is showing inconsistencies after the routine Sunday update. I've tried everything in your documentation, but nothing's working." I remembered the error notification I'd seen just before leaving. "Did you run the verification sequence on the secondary tables?" I asked. "Yes, but the systems aren't reconciling. Heather said to just force an override, but that doesn't seem right." I winced. "Definitely don't do that. It could corrupt the entire trial dataset." "That's what I thought," Jacob sighed. "I told Brian we should call you, but he said we needed to handle it internally." After providing some guidance, careful not to violate the confidentiality agreement I'd signed, I hung up, feeling a curious mix of vindication and concern. The system I'd built was intricate, with carefully designed fail-safes and interconnection points that weren't immediately obvious, without understanding the underlying architecture. 2 more calls came in that evening from different team members, each describing escalating problems. Apparently, Heather had indeed attempted to force an override, which had triggered cascading errors across multiple client databases. The team was now in emergency mode, trying to prevent data corruption from spreading. I declined to answer the 4th call, which came from Brian's number just before midnight. The next morning, a Tuesday, I had an early interview with PharmaDirect, one of MediSync's competitors. The hiring manager, impressed with my portfolio, asked why I'd left my previous position. "Restructuring," I said simply. "They decided to streamline the database management team." He looked skeptical. "Interesting timing. We just heard MediSync is having major system issues. Something about corrupted trial data?" I kept my expression neutral. "I wouldn't know. I'm no longer with the company." By Wednesday, I had received official offers from both PharmaDirect and another competitor, each with significantly higher salaries than what I'd made at MediSync. A third company requested an interview, mentioning they'd heard excellent things about my architecture skills. Meanwhile, my phone continued to accumulate missed calls from Brian and other MediSync numbers. I didn't return them. The severance agreement didn't include any provision requiring me to provide assistance after termination, and professional ethics prevented me from discussing their system with competitors. But as the calls became more frequent, I wondered just how badly things were unraveling at my former workplace. By Thursday morning, my curiosity got the better of me. I accepted Brian's call on the first ring. "Aurora," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God. We have a situation." "So I've heard," I replied neutrally. "Look, I'll be direct. The system is in complete meltdown. After that initial error on Monday, everything started falling apart. Client dashboards are showing incorrect data, trial records are mismatched, and the regulatory submission module is flagging compliance errors across the board." I closed my eyes, visualizing the cascade of failures, exactly what I'd designed the verification protocols to prevent. "Brian, I signed a severance agreement. I'm no longer an employee." "I understand that," he said quickly. "We'd bring you back as a consultant. Name your rate. We just need you to fix this." The offer was tempting, not for the money, but for the satisfaction of being proven right. However, I knew better than to rush into anything. "I'd need full system access and complete autonomy to implement solutions," I said. "Absolutely," Brian agreed immediately. "Whatever you need. I'll think about it and get back to you this afternoon." After hanging up, I called Jacob for an unofficial assessment of the situation. His description confirmed my suspicions. Heather had implemented emergency fixes that had only worsened the problems, not understanding how each system interconnected with the others. "It's bad, Aurora," Jacob said quietly. "Pharmadyne is threatening to pull their contract. That's 30% of the company's revenue. And there's talk about potential legal action if trial data has been compromised." I spent the morning weighing my options. The professional part of me wanted to rescue the system I'd built. The human part of me felt a certain satisfaction in Brian's desperation. By noon, I'd made my decision and called him back. "I'll help," I said. "My consulting rate is $300 an hour with a minimum engagement of 40 hours, payable up front." Brian didn't even hesitate. "Done. When can you start?" "I'll be there in an hour." Walking back into MediSync felt surreal. Colleagues greeted me with obvious relief, while Brian hovered anxiously nearby. Heather was noticeably absent. "Where's Heather?" I asked as Brian escorted me to a workstation. "She called in sick today," he said, not meeting my eyes. The stress of the situation. I logged into the system with the admin credentials Brian provided and began my assessment. The damage was extensive but followed a logical pattern. Exactly what happens when someone who doesn't understand the architecture tries to force solutions without addressing the underlying issues. By late afternoon, I had stabilized the most critical systems and developed a recovery plan for the rest. Brian checked in frequently, each time more relieved as progress became evident. "You're a lifesaver," he said during one such visit. "I don't know what we were thinking, letting you go." I continued working without responding. The comment wasn't worth acknowledging. As I was preparing to leave for the day, Brian approached with a folder. "I've been authorized to offer you your job back," he said, pushing the documents toward me, "with a 15% raise and a more senior title." I glanced at the offer letter without touching it. "I'll consider it after we resolve the current crisis." "Of course," he nodded eagerly. "Take your time." But as I gathered my things, I noticed an email on Brian's open laptop on the desk beside me. It was from the CEO with the subject line, "Transition plan once system is stabilized." The visible preview text read, "Get everything documented properly this time before we make any changes." I felt a chill. They weren't offering my job back out of recognition of my value. They simply needed me to repair the system and document everything so thoroughly that even Heather could maintain it. Then they'd discard me again. The decision I thought I had was just another illusion. The next morning, I arrived early to continue my recovery work. The system was responding well to my corrections, and I estimated another 2 or 3 days before everything would be fully functional again. I worked methodically, carefully documenting each step, not for Brian's future transition plan, but for my own records. Around midday, the CEO, Victoria Winters, stopped by my workstation. Aurora, I can't tell you how pleased we are that you've returned to help us through this crisis, she said warmly. Brian speaks very highly of your expertise. I nodded politely, continuing to type. The system should be stable by Monday. Wonderful. And I understand Brian has discussed your potential return to a permanent position. He mentioned it, I replied, keeping my focus on the screen. Victoria's smile tightened slightly at my lukewarm response. Well, we'd be delighted to have you back on the team. Perhaps once this situation is resolved, we could discuss the specifics over lunch. Perhaps, I agreed noncommittally. After she left, I took a short break, stepping outside for fresh air. As I scrolled through my phone, a message appeared from an unfamiliar number. Aurora, it's Heather. Can we talk? It's important. Curious, I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop across the street during my lunch break. When I arrived, Heather was already there, looking pale and nervous. Thank you for coming, she said as I sat down. I've been trying to decide whether to tell you this. Tell me what? Heather glanced around before leaning forward. The system failure wasn't an accident. At least, not entirely. I felt my body go still. Explain. Brian asked me to implement some optimizations to the system last week, changes that would streamline the verification processes. He said you had approved the concept but were too busy to implement it yourself. I never approved any such changes, I said, my voice tight. I realized that later, Heather admitted. When things started going wrong on Monday, I told Brian we needed to call you immediately. He refused, saying it would validate your overcomplicated approach and that we could fix it ourselves. She pulled out her phone and showed me a text exchange with Brian from Monday morning. His messages clearly instructed her to attempt fixes without contacting me, even as she expressed increasing concern about the escalating problems. By the time he finally decided to call you, I was having panic attacks. I couldn't sleep knowing what we'd done to the system, what I'd done by trusting him. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Heather's eyes filled with tears. Because they're planning to blame me for everything. Yesterday, HR called me in and said they're conducting an investigation into procedural violations that led to the system failure. Brian told them I made unauthorized changes against his instructions. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Brian had deliberately undermined the system architecture I'd built, likely to prove that his streamlined approach was superior. When everything collapsed, he needed me to fix it. But afterward, Heather would take the fall, and he would emerge as the manager who handled the crisis. I have the job offer from PharmaDirect, Heather continued. I was going to accept it before all this happened. Now Brian's threatening to give me a negative reference if I leave. He says he'll make sure I can't work in pharmaceutical data anywhere. I felt a surge of anger, not just for myself now, but for Heather too. She was younger and less experienced, but she didn't deserve to be manipulated and scapegoated. Forward me those texts, I said, my mind racing. And any other communications you have about the system changes. As Heather compiled the evidence, I realized I had a decision to make. I could walk away with my consulting fee and one of my new job offers, leaving MediSync to its toxic culture. Or I could take action that might help Heather and perhaps other employees, while exposing Brian's sabotage. The choice was obvious. Back at MediSync, I continued the recovery work with renewed purpose. While my hands fixed the technical issues, my mind developed a different kind of solution. What I needed was irrefutable evidence of Brian's deliberate actions, evidence that couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding or technical confusion. I recalled something Jacob had mentioned. All system changes were automatically logged on a secure server for regulatory compliance purposes. Those logs would show exactly who had authorized the optimizations and when they were implemented. During a moment when the office was mostly empty, I accessed the compliance server and found what I was looking for. The logs clearly showed Brian had used his administrative override to approve significant changes to the verification protocols, changes that directly contradicted the system architecture documentation. Most damning of all, he had backdated the approval to make it appear these changes had been pending for weeks. implying my tacit acceptance. I downloaded the logs to a secure drive and then sent myself an encrypted email with the files attached. For good measure, I took screenshots showing the timestamps of the original changes versus the backdated approvals. Now I needed to understand who else was involved. Had Victoria known about Brian's plan to sabotage the system, or was she merely complicit in using the crisis as an opportunity to rehire me temporarily? The answer came unexpectedly when Brian's calendar notification popped up on his laptop during our afternoon status meeting. Discuss AC transition plan with VW, 4:30 p.m. I need a bit more time on the regulatory module, I told Brian. Probably another hour. You go ahead to your meeting. Once he left, I quickly finished my work on the system, then set up one final safety measure, a hidden diagnostic tool that would alert me to any unauthorized changes to the core architecture, sending notifications directly to my personal email. It wasn't technically part of my consulting agreement, but I justified it as professional due diligence. At 5:15 p.m., I packed up my things and prepared to leave for the weekend. The system was now 80% recovered, with only minor issues remaining that I could resolve remotely. As I passed the conference room, I heard Brian's voice rising in frustration. But she's fixing everything. Can't we at least wait until Monday before? Victoria's response was cool and clear. The decision is made. Once she submits the final documentation, we thank her for her consulting work and proceed with the transition to the simplified architecture. Heather was just a trial run. We've already identified another junior developer who can maintain the streamlined system at an even lower salary point. And if it fails again? It won't, because Aurora will have documented every aspect of the recovery process. That's the whole point of bringing her back as a consultant. I'd heard enough. I slipped away before they could exit the conference room, a strange calm settling over me. I now had all the evidence I needed, and a weekend to decide exactly how to use it. Sunday evening, I received a text from Brian. System looking stable. Just need final documentation tomorrow to close out your consulting engagement. CEO wants to meet at 9 a.m. I responded simply, I'll be there. What Brian didn't know was that I'd spent the weekend consulting with both a labor attorney and a regulatory compliance expert at the FDA, who had expressed significant concern about the deliberate manipulation of pharmaceutical trial data systems. I had also accepted the position at Pharma Direct, with a specific condition they had happily accommodated. Monday morning would bring answers to questions Brian and Victoria didn't even know to ask, and I would be ready. I arrived at Medisync at exactly 9 a.m. Monday, carrying a slim portfolio containing my consulting invoice and several other carefully prepared documents. Victoria's executive assistant showed me into the conference room where Victoria, Brian, and two people I didn't recognize, a woman in a severe suit and a nervous-looking man with a legal pad, were already seated. Aurora, thank you for coming, Victoria began with practiced warmth. This is Patricia from HR and Jonathan from Legal. They're here to formalize the conclusion of your consulting engagement. I smiled pleasantly. How convenient. I've brought some documentation that requires legal review as well. Before anyone could respond, the conference room door opened again. Jacob entered, followed by Heather and two men in dark suits who definitely weren't Medisync employees. What is the meaning of this? Victoria demanded, half rising from her chair. I invited a few additional participants, I said calmly. Jacob and Heather have first-hand knowledge relevant to our discussion, and these gentlemen are from the FDA's Office of Regulatory Compliance. They're very interested in the events of the past week. The color drained from Brian's face. The FDA? This is an internal company matter. Actually, one of the agents interrupted, deliberate tampering with systems that manage pharmaceutical trial data falls squarely within our jurisdiction. Ms. Chen contacted our office with evidence suggesting serious compliance violations. I opened my portfolio and distributed copies of a comprehensive report detailing the system architecture, the unauthorized changes, the attempted cover-up, and the impact on client data integrity. The final page contained my sworn statement and signature. This constitutes my final documentation as requested, I said, sliding the original across to Victoria. I've also accepted a position with PharmaDirect starting tomorrow. My first assignment is implementing a rescue plan for all MediSync clients who wish to transfer their data to a more stable platform. Victoria's composure finally cracked. You can't do this. Those clients are under contract. Contracts with specific performance guarantees regarding data integrity. I corrected her. Guarantees you've breached. My attorney has already reviewed the relevant clauses. The FDA agents began asking pointed questions about change management protocols and verification procedures. As the interrogation continued, I quietly excused myself, nodding to Jacob and Heather. My work here was finished. 6 months later, I sat in my new corner office at PharmaDirect, reviewing the quarterly performance report. The transition of former MediSync clients had gone remarkably smoothly, thanks in part to Jacob and Heather, who had both joined me at the new company. The industry newsletter on my desk contained a small item noting that MediSync had been acquired by a larger competitor after experiencing significant client attrition and regulatory challenges. Brian and Victoria had both pursued other opportunities, following an FDA investigation into data integrity violations. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder, a video meeting with our newest pharmaceutical client, formerly MediSync's largest account. Their research director had specifically requested that I oversee their data architecture personally, citing my exceptional reputation for system integrity. As I prepared for the call, Heather knocked on my doorframe. The team wanted me to remind you about the celebration dinner tonight, she said. 1 year since we all started here. I smiled, remembering the day I'd negotiated with PharmaDirect's CEO to bring both Jacob and Heather onto my team as part of my employment conditions. He'd been skeptical until I explained their potential value and their loyalty in providing evidence that helped expose MediSync's violations. I wouldn't miss it, I assured her. My new email notification chimed, the diagnostic system I'd created alerting me that all client databases had completed their verification cycles successfully. The architecture I'd designed here was even more robust than my work at MediSync, incorporating lessons learned from that experience. Some might view what happened as revenge, but I saw it differently. It was simply the natural consequence of valuing systems over the people who built them, of prioritizing short-term savings over expertise and integrity. In the end, I hadn't needed to destroy MediSync. Their own short-sightedness had done that quite effectively without my help. I closed the performance report and prepared to meet with our newest client, ready to demonstrate once again the value of doing things right.